They called themselves Enlightened, the Galactic Coalition of minds older than suns. They had mapped singularities, bent gravity, and erased plagues. But when the war ended, when peace reigned, they grew afraid, not of weapons or entropy, but of what they couldn't control. The Draka were never meant to survive peace. Zarak had been a warborn. His kind were hatched in heat and trained in death. They weren't savage, they were forged. The Draka served as shock troopers, planetfall enforcers, armored scales reflecting laser fire while others hid behind orbital shields. They never flinched. They never surrendered. And for that, the galaxy labeled them monsters once peace no longer needed them. The Council issued the directive in cold data, phase decommission, Draka class assets to be quarantined and culturally sunset. Politely put, extinction by bureaucracy. Systems were sealed. No supply chains. No medical aid. No terraforming updates. Just silence and decay. They framed it as containment. Mercy even. But Zarak knew abandonment when he felt it. His world, Dravkash, was already failing. The star had begun erratic cycles, irradiating the surface. Storms turned acidic, the atmosphere thinning. Crops shriveled. Hatcheries failed. Those who remained died slowly, refusing to beg. That was not their way. But Zarak did. Not for himself, for her. Syrah had been born in the final years, after the Council's verdict. Smaller than the others, slower to adapt. But her eyes glowed brighter than any ember, and her questions never ceased. Why are we the only ones left, Father? When will the sky stop burning? Will the stars remember us? Zarak had no answers. Only stories. Of wars fought for races now silent. Of medals once placed on his claws, now corroded in the corner of their bunker. But she loved those stories. She believed in him. That faith was the only warmth left on that cold, dying world. She grew sick when the winds turned red. The vents failed, oxygen became rationed. The planet's last med station had long since ceased transmission. Zarak searched wreckage and scavenged from dead sectors. A plasma torch here. A sterile unit there. He wasn't a healer, but he built what he could. He rewired a pod from an old fighter's life support. It wasn't perfect, but it kept her breathing. For a while. Each cycle, her voice grew thinner. She no longer asked about stars. Only if he'd stay close. And he did. Even as his armor rusted and his scales dulled. Even when he had to ration his own blood into nutrient packs for the pod. He didn't leave. He tried once more. One last signal burst. Routed through ancient comms, piggybacking on a forgotten beacon. A message to the stars. Draka warrior requests mercy for child. No weapons. No threat. Just one plea. No reply. Not even an automated bounce. Silence, vast and final. Syrah died as the storm howled above. He held her claw in both of his. Her eyes didn't close, Draka eyes never did. They faded slowly, like cooling plasma. He placed her in the pod, turned off the life support to preserve the body. His tears were silent, Draka didn't sob. But his chest cracked inside. He left her in the pod, sealed it under rock, and inscribed her name with his claws. No eulogy. Just 3 words, she was light. Days passed. Maybe weeks. He no longer kept count. The winds stripped the surface clean, howling through the skeletons of cities once called invincible. Zarak stayed in the bunker. Not hiding, waiting. One last duty remained. One more stand. He activated the cryo core. It wasn't made for his kind. The conversion nearly failed. But he calibrated it by instinct. It didn't matter if it hurt. He wasn't seeking sleep. He wanted pause. A stall. A defiance of the death they'd scheduled. As the chamber sealed, he stared at the data crystal beside him. It held everything. His words. Her image. The logs. The request. The betrayal. If no one came, it would mean nothing. But if someone did, if any soul still cared, then they would see not a savage, but a father. The world above him cracked and fumed. Metal structures collapsed into dust. Satellites fell like ashes. But under the ruin, Zarak slept beside the last echo of his child. And still, the council said nothing. The human vessel Lucidity wasn't meant for discovery. It was a deep space salvage ship, mapping derelict sectors for forgotten tech and scrap. The region it entered had been flagged as restricted centuries ago. Redacted records, ghost logs, no recent scans. The crew assumed it was a clerical glitch. It wasn't. Sensors pinged a structure buried beneath layers of ash and tectonic scars. Not a ruin, but something intact, partially powered. They cut through basalt and hardened storm sediment until they found it, a bunker, pre-collapse architecture, sealed, humming faintly. Within minutes, the team realized this wasn't salvage. It was a grave. Inside the chamber lay a pod, battered but functional. Another, adjacent, long deactivated. Within it, the preserved body of a small reptilian humanoid, claws curled inward, skin scaled but cracked, curled in the fetal posture of a child. Next to it, a larger cryo unit. Still active. Still occupied. They thawed the occupant with caution. Biosigns were dormant but intact. Protocol dictated non-interference, but something in the data logs overrode hesitation. The messages etched into the walls, the raw emotion in the recorded plea, the child's name carved with clawed precision. It wasn't alien to them. It was familiar. Loss didn't need translation. When Zarak woke, he didn't move. His eyes scanned the humans. They were soft, unarmored, warm-blooded. They didn't flinch under his gaze. They offered him water. He ignored it. They showed him a hollow, a scan of the preserved child. He stood. Slowly. Every movement deliberate. The crew expected rage. Instead, he bowed his head. Language took days. Zarak spoke in war code, fragmented syntax evolved from battlefield commands. But emotion bridged the gap. He learned quickly. Humans listened more than they spoke, and that disarmed him more than any weapon could have. They asked about the planet. He told them everything. The abandonment. The sickness. The silence. He did not dramatize. He did not beg for sympathy. He simply recited the facts with the weight of someone who had borne them too long alone. The humans shared their findings. His race had been erased from Council history. Diarika yielded 0 hits in current galactic archives. His people weren't remembered as warriors or monsters. They were gone. As if they'd never existed. Zarak asked a single question. Why did you come here? The lead xenologist replied. Because we don't ignore distress calls. Even old ones. Zarak did not respond. But that night, alone in the viewing chamber, he stared at Earth's star chart for hours. They offered him transport. He refused at first. But when they showed him the portable stasis container holding his daughter's remains, secured with care, preserved as best as possible, he agreed. Not for himself. For her. The trip to central galactic space took weeks. During the journey, Zarak spent time with the crew. Not out of friendship, but observation. They weren't efficient. They made jokes during tense moments. They took breaks when work was unfinished. They argued over music. But they worked as a unit, diverse, inconsistent, unrefined, but bound by a stubborn morality he could not dismiss. They asked him what the Diarika had believed. He hesitated, then replied, duty. Honor. Endurance. Then, after a pause, but she believed in kindness. I didn't teach her that. She just had it. When they entered Council territory, the humans filed a formal case, a historic atrocity, a suppressed extinction, the burial of an entire species for political convenience. The Council responded with familiar bureaucratic detachment. No records matched the claim. Evidence appeared tampered. The race in question posed historical security risks. Their tone was calculated indifference. Zarak watched the exchange in silence. He wasn't surprised. The humans were. One of the officers, a young systems engineer, threw his badge on the table after the hearing. "They talk about peace," he said. "But they let a child die to protect a lie." The humans didn't retreat. They escalated. Media leaks. Data dumps. Translated logs. Emotional appeals. Not for fame, but for truth. Zarak stood behind them, always silent. Not because he lacked words, but because their voices carried further now. He spoke once, publicly, for the archive. The recording would be downloaded over 9 million times within days. "I was made for war. I became a father. That's all I wanted to be. You took even that." There was no demand for reparations. No threat. No anger in his voice. Just a statement of loss, undeniable and bare. When the council offered settlement in private, quiet reparations, under sealed agreement, the humans refused. Their proposal was simple: open the records. Admit the truth. Acknowledge the Draka. The council stalled. Zarak watched, for the first time, a species fight, not for land or resources, but for justice not their own. And that, more than anything, made him believe again. The council had underestimated humans. They had expected noise, not persistence. Protest, not preparation. But humanity had mastered resistance long before it reached the stars. They didn't shout louder, they moved with intent. The first motion presented to the Interstellar Tribunal was structured, sourced, and backed by human representatives from 12 systems. Attached were time-stamped logs, stasis readings, and authenticated pre-collapse broadcasts from Dravkash. The Draka weren't mythical, they were betrayed. And the evidence was irrefutable. Council members dismissed the effort as emotional activism. A few even suggested the Draka child was fabricated for sympathy. Zarak didn't respond. He didn't need to. Humans had made the case, not in his name, but in his daughter's. But the real shift came when other species started to listen. The Alari, known for their cultural memory, unearthed a treaty once signed with Draka units during the early wars. The Cernathi recalled a skirmish where Draka troops shielded their evacuation shuttles at the cost of their entire division. Quietly, guilt began to spread through the galactic body. A pattern emerged. Each time a species reviewed its classified archives, mentions of Draka forces surfaced. Always loyal, always discarded. Entire histories rewritten to remove the uncomfortable truth. It wasn't just one betrayal. It was systemic erasure. The Council's authority began to fracture. Deflecting one accusation was easy. Ignoring dozens became impossible. In closed chambers, delegates argued. Some wanted to acknowledge the past. Others feared destabilization. A few insisted on silence to preserve the image of unity. Zarak watched the debates unfold through human feeds. He offered no suggestions. He wasn't here to rebuild the council. His mission had already failed. The child he vowed to protect was gone. All that remained was what the galaxy chose to learn from it. Human leadership refused compromise. They didn't frame the Draka as tragic figures or savage victims. They presented them as what they had been, soldiers who answered a call and were punished for obeying. Then they revealed the last piece. Recovered from Zarak's bunker was a final recording, visual, dated, with unmistakable location data. In it, Zarak is heard whispering to his daughter inside the makeshift pod. His words are soft, unfiltered by translation AI. "Hold on. Someone will come. Someone has to come." The file went viral across human networks, then spread to independent planets. What shocked everyone wasn't the desperation, it was the hope. A dying father still believed the stars might answer. That made the silence of the council deafening. Council representatives tried damage control. They branded the leak as manipulation, a security breach. They accused human media of emotional warfare. But they didn't deny the content. They couldn't. In response, humanity withdrew its research cooperation. Civilian ships began running truth broadcasts across trade lanes. Refugee worlds hosted hollow exhibits honoring extinct species. None mentioned revenge. They just listed facts, names, dates, decisions. And then Zarak spoke again, once. He addressed not the council, but the people of the galaxy. I do not ask for your grief. I do not need your apology. But if the child of a so-called monster deserved even one day of kindness, ask yourselves why none of you gave it. The impact was immediate. Protests flared on capital worlds. Independent systems called for an external truth commission. The council was losing not power, but credibility. And in a political body built on prestige, that was deadlier than any weapon. Within weeks, internal votes shifted. A motion passed. The council would open historical files regarding decommissioned species programs. Not a full confession, but a crack in the wall. Humanity didn't celebrate. They continued pushing. Meanwhile, Zarak began rebuilding, not his legacy, but his identity. He worked with human historians to reconstruct Draka traditions. Not combat training, but cultural records. Rituals, songs, language. Not for war. For memory. He visited terraformed worlds with environments similar to Dravkash. On one of them, he scattered a vial of soil salvaged from his homeworld. He said nothing. He simply stood still while it mixed into the wind. Others began to follow. Survivors of silenced tribes. Refugees from planets abandoned in the Council's slow, mechanical purges. They saw in Zarak not a symbol of power, but of dignity stolen and reclaimed. Humanity didn't uplift him. They stood beside him. And that, more than warships or speeches, forced the galaxy to take notice. The Council hadn't feared Draka's strength. They had feared its memory. And now, that memory refused to die. The Council finally relented, not from principle, but pressure. A resolution passed under global scrutiny, an independent galactic tribunal to investigate the classified extinction of the Draka species and determine whether systemic negligence amounted to sanctioned genocide. For the first time in recorded interstellar governance, a race declared extinct by omission was being brought into formal review. Humans were granted investigative oversight. Zarak declined a seat. His presence, he explained, was not required for truth to surface. Instead, he submitted one item, the data crystal he had carried into cryosleep. Inside was everything: mission logs, battlefield orders, council correspondence, the final distress signal, and the sealed file showing the planetary quarantine directive. All unaltered. All time verified. The inquiry opened with discomfort. Council administrators resisted direct accountability, citing layers of bureaucracy, chain of command complexity, and policy evolutions. But the deeper the tribunal dug, the clearer the pattern became. Draka units had been classified as assets, not individuals. The extinction order had never used the word death. It had used terms like containment, extraction denial, and long-term resolution. Euphemisms stacked over corpses. Testimonies emerged. A Cernathi admiral admitted he'd ignored Draka distress signals in his sector, assuming the protocol prohibited engagement. A former logistics officer confessed she'd watched entire relief missions rerouted away from Dravkash. None claimed malice, only obedience. But none disputed the consequence. A child had died on an abandoned world while the galaxy moved on. Zarak remained silent during the proceedings. When asked to speak again, he delivered only one line. Obedience without conscience is complicity. That statement redefined the inquiry. The tribunal concluded systemic neglect was not only present, but willful. The Council hadn't orchestrated the extinction directly, but through policy, omission, and silence, it ensured no Draka would survive. The final judgment declared the erasure of the Draka as a moral failure of the highest order. Reparation frameworks were drafted. Archival corrections began. But something deeper shifted: cultural reckoning. Systems that once ignored their pasts began digging into them. Species revisited suppressed alliances, hidden wars, buried betrayals. New educational mandates required teaching the fates of not just victors, but those discarded afterward. The Draka weren't rewritten as saints. They were recorded as real. Zarak, when informed of the decision, simply nodded. He did not celebrate. His daughter was still gone. His people remained ash and bone. But the galaxy had finally stopped pretending they had never existed. That mattered more than applause. He declined most interviews. He avoided spotlight. But he accepted one invitation: Earth's Interstellar Remembrance Assembly. There, among thousands of delegates, he walked alone to the center dais, holding the sealed stasis container carrying Syrah's remains. He did not speak. He placed it on the pedestal reserved for fallen heroes and left without ceremony. The assembly chamber remained silent for 12 full minutes after he exited. Following the tribunal's ruling, DRAK genetic traces were identified in frozen archives. Scattered samples survived, coded into inert biological databases, mislabeled as unclassified xenogenic templates. Human scientists offered to attempt recombination, not to clone soldiers, but to recover culture. Zarak agreed on one condition: no weaponization. If they were reborn, it would be as thinkers, growers, dreamers. Restoration projects began. The language was reconstructed. Art recovered. Newborns would carry ancient names. The first bioengineered DRAK child was born in orbit above Earth. Her eyes mirrored Syrah's, bright, endless, unafraid. Zarak visited her only once. He stood behind the observation glass, watching as she took her first steps inside the gravity-adjusted chamber. When asked what he felt, he answered, "It's not mine to claim. It's hers to define." Galactic broadcasts called it redemption. But Zarak saw it differently. Not redemption. Responsibility. Justice could not erase history, but it could ensure the next page was written with eyes open. The Council's credibility never recovered fully. Many systems broke into smaller, more accountable unions. Human diplomacy surged, not from dominance, but from trust. They had proven that empathy, when backed by persistence, could reshape civilization. Zarak never returned to Dravkash. There was nothing left to retrieve. But he wore a small glass pendant around his neck, filled with soil from the planet's last untouched patch, taken from beneath Syrah's pod. He never removed it. Even in silence, he carried her forward. The tribunal added a final clause to its ruling. One sentence. In memory of those who waited for help that never came, and in honor of those who arrived, even when it was too late. It was not enough. But it was something. Years passed. The galaxy changed, slowly but with permanence. Systems once ruled by indifference learned caution. Old powers retreated behind policy reforms and public contrition. Entire sectors re-examined their histories, purging misinformation, reinstating erased cultures, and confronting uncomfortable truths. Among them, one name, DRAK, was no longer myth or shadow. It became a test of memory, a measure of integrity. On Earth, a memorial was built not of grandeur, but intent. No statues. No plaques of glory. Just a single corridor carved into the side of a remote lunar cliff, walls etched with every known DRAK name recovered from Zarak's archives. Many names were incomplete, just designations, code names, or battlefield monikers, but each was etched with care. At the corridor's center, a chamber held two simple stasis pods, one empty, one sealed. Inside the sealed unit rested Syrah, unaltered, untouched. Visitors came not to honor victory, but to remember failure, the failure to answer, to see, to act. Zarak's role became quieter. He declined leadership offers, research grants, and ambassadorial titles. His purpose had never been political. He taught instead, instructing at human academies in philosophy, ethics, and resilience. Not the kind learned in war, but the kind forged in aftermath. His lessons were never loud. He rarely referenced his past unless asked directly. When he did, it was with precision, not to relive, but to clarify. You survive loss by refusing to let it turn you into what caused it. His teachings spread farther than he ever traveled. Soldiers quoted him. Doctors studied his poise under grief. Parents showed their children his archived speeches, not because of what he fought through, but because of how he stood after. The child born from reconstructed DRAK code, named Kale, grew under global care. Earth offered sanctuary, but never claimed custody. She was raised by a rotating mentorship circle of teachers, philosophers, and cultural caretakers, many of whom had no relation to her biologically but treated her like legacy, not of blood, but of conviction. As she aged, she learned everything Zarak had fought to preserve: language, heritage, values. Kale visited Zarak when she turned 13. She had questions, ones only he could answer. He offered no myths, no dramatized tales. Just the truth: who the Draka were, what they had become, and why they had vanished. When she asked him if he hated those who let them die, he paused before answering. No. But I remember them. She understood. That single response became a cornerstone of how her generation viewed justice, not as vengeance, but as vigilance. Zarak aged. Time, though slowed by regeneration treatments, did not pause. His body wore down, and he accepted it without resistance. Not with resignation, but with clarity. When he felt his end nearing, he returned to the moon one final time, standing in the memorial corridor. Alone. Not for mourning. For gratitude. Not for what was taken, but for what was saved. He left behind one final message, recorded without audience or embellishment. If survival is all we ever seek, we are already dead. We must seek more, to be seen, to be known, to be remembered rightly. Let pain become warning, not foundation. His death was not marked by planetary mourning or grand ceremonies. Instead, across thousands of systems, a moment of silence was observed, not by decree, but by choice. Ships paused transit. Schools dimmed lights. Broadcasts went quiet. Not for spectacle, but in acknowledgement. Kale continued his work. She became more than symbol. She became a voice, clear, firm, relentless. She refused pedestal treatment, often stating that she was not the future of the Draka, but the reminder of what was almost lost. Her advocacy reframed interspecies relations. Where once the Council operated on fear and control, newer interstellar compacts formed through mutual accountability, with records transparency as a non-negotiable principle. Across emerging colonies, the Draka legacy was woven not through bloodlines, but ideas. Their cultural archive, rebuilt from fragments and recovered memories, became open source. Not sacred, not locked away, shared freely, as Zarak had wished. The story of a father who waited, a child who trusted, and a species that was buried not by war but by silence lived on, not as fiction, but as lesson. Not every world would remember. Not every system would care. But enough would. Enough to ensure that next time, when a cry came from the dark, someone would answer, not because they had to, but because they chose to. And in that, the Draka were never truly gone.